Hello and a warm welcome to yet another episode of the Mission Shunya podcast. If this is the first time you are listening to the podcast, welcome. Shunya means zero in the native Indian language, and the platform will cover all stories related to the global progress to the zero carbon economy. And if you are a regular listener, I want to thank you for helping spread the message and stories from the podcast channel to a wider audience. Together, we can keep moving forward to the global net zero targets. And forward we shall move in the post-COVID world, and back to discussing the big picture and the big stories on this transition to a net zero economy. On this episode, we will cover the story from down under. Before I get to that, just want to remind you that we will have one more interesting action item after the interview, so stick around till the end of the episode. So now on to this week's feature segment. Recently, ClimateWorks Australia published the Decarbonisation Futures study, a study that outlined the trajectory for Australia to get to net zero by 2050. ClimateWorks Australia's primary goal is to enable Australia reach its net zero emissions by 2050. The recent study undertaken by them was building on an earlier report evaluating the decarbonisation pathways for Australia. The study, as you would expect, was a comprehensive one, looking at various scenarios for Australia to reach its targets. And in fact, the study predicts that Australia could get there even before time. I got in touch with the team behind the report and we got talking about it. So, who's our guest for this episode?
Hi, I'm Tom Yankos from ClimateWorks Australia. I'm a senior project manager here, and I've been working on over the last couple of years on the Decarbonisation Futures research that I'm about to tell you about. My work at ClimateWorks Australia covers off all sectors of the economy, in particular looking at how we're able to reach net zero emissions by 2050.
So, Tom, let's begin by looking at what ClimateWorks does in general and what's your core focus in research?
So ClimateWorks Australia is a not-for-profit organisation. So we work at Monash University in Victoria and specifically within the Monash Sustainable Development Institute. We're funded by philanthropy as well as project funding from a range of industry and government. And this gives us a great amount of independence that we utilise in our research. Our research focuses on all sectors of the Australian economy, and particularly with the aim to act as a trusted advisor for business and government, creating evidence-based advice on the solutions and implementation to reach net zero emissions by 2050.
That's wonderful. Now, in particular, recently you came up with the report, Decarbonisation Futures study in around April. What was the foundation for this study? When did it all begin?
So Decarbonisation Futures started a couple of years ago when we realised that a lot had changed in the landscape with regard to decarbonisation futures. Particularly a lot of changes regarding the rate of change of technologies and also some changes in the economy. Different sectors had grown or changed, and we sought to update the analysis for the time that had passed, but also to try and capture some of these newer aspects that weren't in that original report in 2014.
That's good to know. So I can understand that the 2014 study was like a foundation for this study. And as you mentioned that there has been a lot of change, particularly from the technology front. But what are the other scenario plannings that you considered in the study in comparison to the 2014 one?
So the biggest change between the 2014 DDPP and Decarbonisation Futures is that Decarbonisation Futures takes a scenario approach and investigates 3 different scenarios, whereas the 2014 report only focused on one. One way of thinking about this is that the 2014 report was around showing that it was technically possible to reach net zero emissions by 2050, whereas previous analyses at the time had only focused on different percentages of reduction, say 80% reduction or 90% reduction, whereas that sought zero by 2050. That since has become a lot more common amongst targets from different governments, both at the state level and other countries worldwide. And so Decarbonisation Futures is looking at different pathways to zero. So rather than trying to illustrate, is it possible, which we certainly wanted to show that it is still possible, but what are some factors that can influence how we can get there? and also, which is new for this analysis, how we could reach 1.5 degrees or a 1.5 degree compatible trajectory for Australia.
You do mention about the 1.5 degree compatible trajectory, and that is what I think you call all-in approach. But you also have the other two scenarios also, the 2C deploy and the 2C innovate. At a broad level, what are these three scenarios? How different are these?
So I might start with a bit of a background as to how we landed on those scenarios, and that sort of starts with the nature of climate change as an issue, and in particular, as you can appreciate, has very complex interactions, particularly between natural systems and man-made systems, and as such, the future is very uncertain. It's very hard to model. In order to handle that uncertainty, one tool that decision makers use that we found useful to provide information with is to investigate different potential futures or investigate different scenarios to help them to navigate that uncertainty. So during the development of Decarbonisation Futures, we drew together our project supporters and internal experts, and we investigated what are the likely to be the most uncertain and also what are the most material or impactful factors going forward that would impact the trajectory to reach net zero emissions by 2050. These boil down to three drivers in the end, which we characterize in the report as policy, technological innovation, and business and individual action. So the three scenarios basically come out of that process. There's two that test the variations of reaching a 2 degree outcome, and as we mentioned, one that explores the potential for a 1.5 degree outcome. The 2C deploy scenario, the first of the 2 degree scenarios, focuses on accelerated deployment of demonstration and mature stage technologies, and this scenario is primarily achieved through strong policy action, whereas the alternative 2C innovate scenario models technological improvement, what we expect to be at the upper bound of current expectations. That's driven by supportive policy, but also demand from businesses and individuals. The 1.5C all-in scenario is named because it's exactly that. It requires and it shows a combination of policy, technological innovation, and action from businesses and individuals to limit emissions to 1.5 degrees.
That's a good way of classifying those three scenarios, and I'm particularly interested in the 2C innovate, where you want some kind of push or pull rather from the industries also in delivering net zero emissions. So as a part of the report, you do mention that the decade running up to 2030 is kind of going to be the crucial for this transition. What is the particular reasoning behind this conclusion?
Yeah, so this is really a critical decade up to 2030 for a couple of reasons. One is the physical side of things, and that's when you look at the carbon budget or what is the cumulative amount of emissions that we're able to put into the atmosphere before we reach a certain temperature threshold. When we look at that, we only have 8 years worth of emissions at the current rates globally to have a good chance of staying under 1.5 degrees C. So that's one of the reasons that the 2030 timeframe becomes important. The another aspect is the rate of change that's required across many of the sectors. A lot of those, particularly electricity, where we do have the technologies that are ready to be implemented at scale to reduce emissions very significantly. And one of the unique aspects of our modelling is that it takes a long-term approach. It basically solves for the entire time period between 2020 to 2050 and figures out across all the different sectors what is the lowest cost way of reaching those emissions. And given the ability and the availability of the technologies in the electricity system, that happens quite soon. And also, given the way that electricity interacts with other sectors of the economy through their Scope 2 emissions and the provision of electricity to sectors, by decarbonising that electricity, you're enabling the emissions reductions in other sectors. So essentially, that's a prerequisite for abatement. And a lot of that happens in the short term, or in the near term, I should say, between now and 2030, with reductions in the electricity system up to about 73% in emissions.
That's good to know. And as you rightly said, we have a limited carbon budget, not just in Australia, but throughout the world. I mean, every country.
That's right.
So 2030 is like really going to be crucial, and it aligns with other climate targets as well, as agreed by different countries as part of the Paris Climate Agreement. Now, going back to the other part of the research, you did use analysis from various other sources because you built upon a previous study. So, what was different in the analysis that you undertook for this report? What are the other research that you drew upon, the conclusions that you took into this study to kind of finalize your recommendations and finalize the report under this period?
So we had the base of the 2014 DDPP as a bit of a framework for our understanding of roughly where the sectors are that would decarbonise. But what had changed very significantly is, as might have mentioned before, is around the electricity, particularly the pace of change of both of the costs of solar and wind, who have plummeted much quicker than certainly our original analysis had predicted. And also related to that is a reduction in cost of batteries, which not only facilitate higher levels of renewable penetration, but also allows for more of transport to be electrified. So there were two areas that had changed quite significantly since our previous work, one being the much faster rollout and cheaper rollout of renewable electricity, and more vehicles being able to be electrified. We were very fortunate that we completed this analysis with the support of CSIRO, which is Australia's peak scientific agency or research agency, whose energy flagship team undertook the analysis of the transport and the electricity sector. So we cooperate a times model with them, and that enabled us to have a very, very detailed analysis and site-by-site indication of electricity in particular. So in addition to that work with CSIRO, we were able to draw on previous analysis of the other sectors from the deep decarbonisation pathway work, as well as some newer external sources to inform our analysis. A couple that come to mind for the agricultural sector was the Meat and Livestock Australia. They did some work on what was the potential pathways to reduce emissions in cattle, for example. And also Beyond Zero Emissions did some work around the potential of material shifts to reduce emissions in the building sector that was drawn on. A mix of in-house analysis, expertise from CSIRO, and also some external sources in order to inform the analysis that we produced.
You do mention about the different sectors that you looked into. The report is a comprehensive one, so it's looked into different sectors. And also the report looks at the technology maturity of different options that is available. So how do you put this both together? You classify the technologies, if I'm right, into mature, demonstrated, and emerging technologies. And based on where the technology is at the current point in time, you kind of make recommendations for different sectors. So how did this come about?
Great question. And as you can imagine, this was actually a topic of many discussions throughout the development of this research, the categorization of where technologies are and the like. We didn't solely rely on a techno-economic assessment here, which has been done or has been used in other forums to position technology, say, on a cost curve. Cost or the availability is one aspect, but we also wanted to recognize and to illustrate the availability of the solutions that can be rolled out now compared to what is needed to support now, and which technologies might be a little bit further over the horizon, and costs don't always provide that single lens. So that's how we landed on a categorization of mature, demonstrating, emerging. And ultimately, when you look at the flip side of that is around the recommendations of those different technologies, technology categorizations, where for mature solutions and demonstrated solutions, here the task is really to accelerate their deployment, because we know that there either already are the cost-effective solution, or there's barriers that are understood to overcome in order to make them effective to be rolled out. Whereas technologies or solutions that are more emerging, the role right now is to invest in R&D in order to be ready or to reduce those technologies in cost for when we do need them over the horizon to reduce emissions. And these, whilst all sectors have different challenges and each sector has a unique role to play, there's a bit of a clustering of technologies and technology readiness across each of those sectors. So in electricity and buildings, we've found that zero emissions is doable with technologies that are already mature and demonstrated. In transport, we've got a bit of a mix between a maturity of for short-haul transport that can be readily electrified, which contrasts with long-haul, where zero emissions fuels are likely to be needed, and the supply chains for those, for example, would need some preparation. And it's a similar story in industry and agriculture. Whilst there are solutions and activities that we can do now to reduce emissions and improve efficiency, a lot of the really getting to zero technologies are still in development and are still emerging and need a bit more support in order to reduce the emissions in those sectors.
That's interesting. You do mention about transportation. So I'll have to ask you this question. What is the role of hydrogen in the study that you've undertaken, especially for the transportation sector?
Yeah, we modeled hydrogen, particularly in heavy vehicles. The cost efficiencies and the cost of battery vehicles in light vehicles, so light passenger and even to a certain extent light commercial vehicles, comes out on top. So we do see a very high proportion of battery electric for light vehicles, but we do see hydrogen play a role in the heavier vehicles, particularly freight transport. Australia is a wide brown land. We do rely on trucks to get a lot of things across our country. And at the moment, both the technological availability and the weight and balance type of approaches, hydrogen is looking like the technology that could provide us a solution with reducing emissions in those heavy transport situations.
Fantastic. It's good to know about the significance of hydrogen in addition to battery technology, which you have obviously considered. Tom, now different sectors are in different levels of maturity or feasibility, if I could put it that way. I'm sure there are sectors that are likely to miss out on their targets to get to net zero by, say, 2050. What are those sectors in your study?
So I might start by illustrating the change between what we saw in 2014 to this study, being about 5 years of difference. And that is that we weren't able to see nearly as much reduction in transport sector as we're able to now. A combination of battery performance, hydrogen vehicles, and also the prevalence of potential availability and cost of biofuels allows us to get down pretty low in terms of emissions in transport. And that's changed since 5 years ago. The reason I mention that is because although at the moment the sectors that we see don't get to zero are particularly in industry, in parts of industry and also agriculture. However, if we do this analysis again in 5 years, which I hope we do and update it, we would expect that to change. In the meantime, we utilise nature-based solutions such as carbon forestry to help compensate for the residual emissions from those sectors in order to get to net zero by 2050. But like I say, hopefully in a few years' time, as technology matures and we make more progress towards zero, that there will be other solutions in order to reduce those emissions, those residual emissions in industry and agriculture.
That perfectly leads me to my next question, because you do mention about the timeframes and the need to kind of revisit the study from periodically. You did it in 2014, now you're doing it in 2020. But there is a bit of conclusion that you say that Australia would leapfrog to net zero by 2050. Are you very optimistic with that, or do you think that it's definitely possible to get there before 2050?
Unfortunately, we've missed our chance to start reducing emissions in the last decade. So that's why we've now entered this transformational decade to climate action. And in order to stay within the global 1.5 and 2 degree carbon budget and climate goals, the emissions really do need to head towards zero at a steep pace. So the good news is that our analysis finds that we can do this, and we can do this by accelerating the deployment and development of available technologies. And this will allow us to leapfrog to net zero emission solutions.
And now coming to the important part of the implementation, what from your opinion is a crucial part to the implementation process? Policy is going to be key. How different is it in Australia today compared to when a report of this kind was released in 2014? What are the implications of policy actions on the projections that you make? I believe like most of the states in Australia have made some commitments towards getting to net zero. So what's your opinion on the policy front?
Yeah, that's right. A lot of the states, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but a lot of the states do have net zero targets, either enshrined in law or they are seeking to have targets. Ultimately, the kind of acceleration that's needed to keep on track to net zero emissions won't happen in time without strong action by government, but also from businesses and individuals. So the role that governments in particular have to play is around developing supportive policies, around removing roadblocks. There's a role in making direct investments and also incentivizing the private sector to invest and to act. But it's by no means only the government or policy's role. Businesses will be critical in aligning their products and services, what they purchase and what they're selling, reducing emissions in their operations, their R&D investments, and as I mentioned, their procurement. And for businesses, simply setting a net zero target can be an important first step in that direction. Individuals also have a role to play here. One of the interesting aspects of the innovation scenario and also the all-in scenario is the role of individuals. Throughout our research, understanding the barriers to or what could be the drivers of some of these abatement solutions is really the desire to see greener products be available in the market. That could be through right from a desire to make sure that the concrete you use, or that if you're building a house, to request that the concrete you use is low emissions, or seeking out green electricity from your provider when you're changing electricity providers, and eventually purchasing an electric vehicle. All of these things are decisions along the way that can help the transition or support the transition. So, yeah, the government and policies do have a very key role to play, businesses and individuals also.
That's really interesting. And I'm sure that's also the right way to put it, because most of the market forces, or the market in general, is shaped by the consumer. Consumer, in this case, individuals, and what is their preferred choice. I'm sure if a lot of individuals demand a certain kind of product that is more sustainable, I'm sure the market has to provide that. So market forces will kind of align with what the individual wants. And it's good that you mention and highlight the role of individual in getting to net zero. Tom, on a final point, the study must have been prepared prior to the COVID pandemic. So what do you think is going to be the impact of the pandemic on the targets that you mentioned in the report, if there is going to be any that you foresee?
Yeah, indeed, the report was prepared before the pandemic. And as someone currently living in Melbourne, which under what is apparently now the strongest restrictions anywhere in the world, I think the total impacts are too early to tell, unfortunately. However, whilst the magnitude might be a little bit uncertain, this pandemic definitely doesn't change the need for these actions. The equipment that turns back on when the economy eventually does restart, these will still be using fossil fuels or emitting the same way as it was, unless it's upgraded. A great example of this is the car in my garage. I don't drive an electric vehicle just yet, so if I need to get somewhere when I am allowed out of the house, it'll still be in an internal combustion engine vehicle. But there is certainly opportunity provided by this moment in time, because the disruption makes a bit of a make or break moment for climate action. It really is causing the leaders of every government and every business to focus on the urgent emergency responses, and there's always a pressure to bounce back. And this increases the risk that doing things in a climate-friendly way can be overlooked or even potentially deliberately deferred. However, we hope that businesses and governments bounce forward as our former board member has said, rather than bounce back and to capture the opportunity that this disruption takes in order to put things or focus on the way that things can be done in a climate-friendly way going forward.
Wonderful. I'm sure that's a good way to look at it. Look at it as a opportunity to kind of go forward rather than come back. Hope there is a lot of government action, the stimulus of whatever comes from the governments are positive and aid the transition to net zero. So, Tom, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast and discuss the study in detail. So, it was a wonderful study, a comprehensive one. And thanks for taking time to join me on the podcast.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's been a pleasure.
So, that was our guest from ClimateWorks, and I hope you found the conversation insightful. As you heard earlier in the chat, the three scenarios look at a range of options, right from a conservative approach to an all-in approach that aims to limit the temperature rise to below 1.5 C. Among all the global net zero studies, including the UK's, in fact that was featured earlier on the podcast series, the crucial assumption is that we will have a significant penetration of renewable energy in the grid by 2030. And another crucial factor in the global race to net zero will be the electrification of transportation sector. And like everything else, the road to net zero can be reached only if there is an acceptance from the consumers and a favorable environment to support it. There is a need to have the policy push while at the same time individuals and businesses need to get their act together. And let's be optimistic that we have both of these happening at the same time as we move along. On that note, let's get to this week's action item towards Mission Shunya. I will stick with this week's theme of net zero at a country level. Well, the very first time I was moved by the idea of going 100% renewable energy was when I worked for the company with that mission statement. It also got me thinking about the possibility of having 100% of our energy needs supplied by clean energy sources. And the very first resource that I found was a book, Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air, written by Professor David Mackay from the University of Cambridge. The one book changed the way people thought about the subject, and the impact of Professor Mackay's work was very significant. Many governments, including the UK, India, and a few other countries, have adopted his approach and devised tools to evaluate the feasibility of having sustainable energy in the grid mix. Professor Mackay was a strong proponent of this idea and wanted to get actual numbers do the talking. Unfortunately, he is no more, but his work definitely lives on. So feel free to get a copy of the book. It's available as a free copy online. And you can also check the net zero calculators built around the work developed by UK, India, and a few other countries. I'm sure you will enjoy playing around with the online calculator to check the multiple scenarios at a country level. I'll put the links to all the resources on the episode page. It will be on the Mission Shunya website, so do check it out and let me know your views. You can do that by sending me an email, missionshunya@gmail.com. And definitely Mission Shunya is always active on the social media channels, so feel free to tag Mission Shunya. The handle is @Mission Shunya across Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. And before we sign off, just wanted to thank my friend Michael Lee, who helped me in connecting with the people at ClimateWorks Australia, who published the report that was discussed on this show. And finally, hope you have subscribed to this show because I'll be back in 2 weeks' time with yet another podcast episode. And if you like the show, do give a rating, write a review, or share it with friends or colleagues. It takes only about 30 seconds to share the episode link to 3 people in your network. So please consider doing that. So signing off, this is Girish Shivakumar, and as always, thank you for listening.